Hey everyone, we're going to be doing something a little different today because I'm not putting out my normal Isaiah lesson because the person teaching that lesson on Sunday is going to be Abraham Gileadi to my class live. And I'm going to put out a recording of that later, which is awesome. But in the meantime, I just want to do a quick little message about some other things that I am personally seeing in Mosiah 11 through 17. To get a grasp on this, first, we need to understand a little bit of the history. What you have are the people of Nephi, and they are being led out from the land of Nephi to the land of Zarahemla. Now, this is a fulfillment of the prophecy that we spoke about in Pride, Polygamy, and Parables, where Jacob was telling his people, if you don't stop committing these whoredoms, meaning concubinism and polygyny, and the hoarding of wealth, you will be destroyed, and God will lead a people out from among you. And this is the same pattern, right? We're seeing this over and over again in the Book of Mormon. And he's saying that the very reason why Lehi, Nephi, and Jacob himself were led out from, well, maybe not Jacob because he was born later, but were led out from the land of Jerusalem is because people were practicing polygyny there in Jerusalem. That is one of the reasons that he specifically mentions is why they were led out. So what happens here? Well, they're destroyed. Some people are led out. They go to the land of Zarahemla, but what happens? You have a group of people who decide to go back to the land of Nephi. Now, this goes hand in hand with what I taught in Pride, Polygamy, and Parables with a scripture in Deuteronomy that specifically is speaking to polygyny, and it's speaking about the hoarding of wealth. And it says, don't go back. Don't go back to where you came from and go back to those old ways. But what happens? They go back. And in one generation, they go back to the polygyny, back to the concubinism. And it's a really interesting story because it doesn't take long before they are destroyed essentially as well. But what I find really, really interesting here is how the author here, I'm going to assume it's Mormon, is really making a statement this time with the language that he's using regarding what Noah is doing. So for instance, he says, Noah did not keep the commandments of God, but he did walk after the desires of his own heart. He had many wives and concubines, and he caused his people to commit sin and do that which was abominable. This is very strong language, right? In the sight of the Lord, and they did commit whoredoms. So he's using this word whoredoms here, right? And all manner of wickedness. And then if you go on, he's saying that because of the taxation that he is putting onto these people, and remember, there's not a separation of church and state here. So he's taken all the priests who had the true gospel, he's replacing them with his own puppet priests, essentially, to preach his own gospel that supports him in his wicked beliefs of hoarding of women, hoarding of wealth, becoming a wine bibber, all of that kind of thing, right? And he says that this taxation is to support his wives and his concubines and also his priests and their wives and their concubines. And so he completely overhauls the affairs of the kingdoms. But what's important here, I think, is the language in verse 14. And here the author says that he placed his heart upon riches. Yes, he spent his time in riotous living with his wives and his concubines, and so did also his priests spend their time with harlots. Wait a minute. Didn't we just hear that these priests had wives and concubines? Were they going out and paying prostitutes? What's going on here? Well, first of all, no, because these were the religious leaders who were setting themselves up, right, as some sort of moral authority, specifically in following the law of Moses. They were not going out and paying prostitutes. What is this about? Then look at what Jesus says, specifically through the prophet Abinadi. Woe be unto this people, for I have seen their abominations and their wickedness and their whoredoms. What Jesus himself is saying here, remember, this is the same Jesus who in Pride, Polygamy, and Parables, we discussed that he was the champion of women, that he established some kind of a structure within the church or the religion that he set up, that Joseph Smith was trying to establish through the Relief Society that he said was the true order of heaven. And what this Jesus is saying is it doesn't matter if you legally marry these people. It doesn't matter if you call them wives or concubines or whatever you want to call them. Just because you give them a title of wife, that does not make them a wife. Essentially, you're still just paying for sex. You are prostituting these women. And Abinadi, interestingly enough, is using the law of Moses to show them how they are committing whoredoms. And we discussed this. It's in Deuteronomy, but you could say, well, maybe that's just with kings multiplying wives. But we also have the Damascus document. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls now, which specifically state that anything more than one wife is technically fornication. So this is a law of Moses that he's saying, if you were really following the law of Moses, you would not be having more than one wife, because this is something that we were specifically commanded not to do. So you can see this pattern again and again, where God gives people a gospel, where God is trying to elevate women, just like Jesus did, and people are perverting it. They're twisting it to turn it into something that plays into their own lusts, that worships the natural man over the true God. And this is exactly what Abinadi is saying. He is saying that these people are idolatrists. Now, they are following the law of Moses. Are they worshiping images of Baal? No. The idolatry is, rather than worshiping the true God, they are worshiping a religion. They are worshiping some scriptures and some rules and some things that they are manipulating and tweaking to actually worship and serve Satan, ultimately, who is the author of these things. And we won't get into that too much. But what happens every time is that the people who suffer as a result of this manipulation of God's true religion, worship of the true God, the women and children are always the ones who suffer in these circumstances. And so what happens? They are destroyed, just like we've shown in history and in statistics and all these things. They are destroyed, and a righteous remnant is let out. And this is the pattern again and again and again in the Book of Mormon. Maybe it doesn't always manifest as polygyny and concubinism, but it is always manifested in the subordination and the harm done to women and children. All right, so that is this week's overview for Mosiah. I hope you'll keep that in mind as you continue your reading throughout the rest of the Book of Mormon and pray about these things and really see what is the true religion of Christ or doctrine of Christ. Like, what does that really look like, and what has it been supplanted with over the years that allows for the hoarding of wealth, the hoarding of women, and these things that Christ himself calls abominations, whoredoms, and harlotry. All right, see you later.